Hi guys, tonight we are talking about speed foundations. May not be tonight where you are, but for me, you got to put the kids down to bed before you can start recording at home. So we're talking about speed foundations, where speed comes from, and how to get more of it. I would say that with this approach to speed, um, we are typically going to focus on efforts that are they're going to revolve around that phosphagen energy system. So you can argue, there's arguments that, sprints last up to 400 meters, which may be around that, depending on who you are, maybe in the mid 40s to over a minute in length. So, but for most of our sprinting, think more like efforts that are going to take less than 30 seconds, maybe even less than 20 seconds, because we really want to focus on that phosphagen energy system. And we want to harp so much on acceleration. So many sports need to accelerate, and that's going to be a big focus of what we're talking about tonight, or whenever the heck you're listening to this. What is speed? Well, essentially we're getting from point A to point B in less time. So that could be in a marathon, or that could be, like I was just saying, in those shorter efforts that last between a couple of seconds and maybe 30 seconds or so. And essentially, and we're going to talk about running mostly, but a lot of the science and logic is going to carry over to swimming, cycling, I guess rowing. But really it's the combination of stride frequency, or the rate at which we have turnover in our steps, and stride length. So how far are we getting from the planting of one foot? And for our purposes today, a stride will be referenced as the planting of one foot, that drive to the next point that same foot hits. So I would measure the distance from an athlete sprinting from either their right foot contact to the ground, and then their left foot's going to contact, and then their right foot again. So I would measure between the two right foot contacts, and that would give me my stride length. So if we increase either stride frequency or stride length, those athletes are going to start getting from point A to point B in less time. And I'm going to be very straightforward that it is my bias and my belief that increasing stride length is the more efficient manner or method for improving speed. So if we wanted to improve stride frequency, how do we go about it? Well, I'll first warn you that many sprinters are already operating with 3 to 5 strides per second in a sprint. Now you can improve that turnover rate, and some ways to do that would be an overspeed treadmill. So some of these have like a big giant harness and carousel above the treadmill, and the athlete's going to be put into a belt, and they're going to be taking the speeds of running that they can hardly control. And so they've got that belt and that harness and that system, so that if they trip and fall or slip or sustain an injury, that harness is going to sort of salvage them and keep them safe from maybe sustaining worse injuries. But the goal there is to improve their ability to produce stride frequency. Assisted running, so perhaps a big bungee cord tied to the front side of an athlete as they're getting prepared to take off on a run. Some wall drills, so without the stress of gravity and force and propulsion, just doing some movements against a wall gives you an opportunity to practice and potentially reach a faster stride rate per second. Some step drills, so practicing where you're actually going to be stepping and how you're going to be stepping. So basically trying to find that sweet spot biomechanically from where to place your feet to give you the best, the longest step you can have without being too long, where it's going to cause biomechanical issues and maybe some muscular strains, and also being ideal for force production. And again, any in-place drills such as sprinting in place. So if there's any fans of the coach Lee Taft, one of the assessments that he'll do online is he'll actually video record athletes sprinting in place, and he's going to pull from that some biomechanics, some speed of strides per second, and he's going to use that as a very raw and basic movement assessment to help them with their future sprinting work. And if you wanted to do downhill running, that's another option as well. And essentially, from what I understand, a 3% down grade going downward is sort of ideal or maximal. And I've heard of multiple coaches just who might have a grate or a sewer on the field or near the field, and they will have their athletes run down towards it because the surrounding area near the grate or near the sewer is supposed to be graded down towards it. So they'll just use that sort of natural geography, I guess. Topography, I suppose, would be the correct word there. And more on that stride frequency. Well, looking at this study here, it's basically going to show that stride frequency is going to remain the same in individuals from about age 2 to about age 16. And what's really changing, why a 16-year-old is going to tend to outrun a 2-year-old, is the stride length. So this is just sort of a microcosm or micro example of really sort of what I believe is that our stride frequency is almost kind of topped out naturally, and where there's really more meat on the bone to make an impact would be with increasing our stride length. And how are we going to improve stride length? Biomechanics, so optimizing our movement pattern and increasing strength, which will increase power, which will hopefully it will increase our rate of force development. And we'll talk more about that soon. And I need to put a space in between force and development. Sorry about that. So, getting our athletes to increase their stride length is basically where we're going to have a bigger impact. Let's look at these biomechanics. Now, not every athlete is going to start a sprint out of that set position, but essentially what they'll do is fall into that leaning acceleration position. In this graphic, it is labeled as block clearance, but we could just as easily see a basketball player, a soccer player, a football player being in that second position during the middle of a play. You know, all it takes is one turnover, and those athletes, you're going to see all the athletes on the field decelerate, hunker down, and then turn around and start running towards the new direction of the ball. So we can pull a lot of lessons and skills from our top level sprinters, maybe our track athletes. So we can pull from them. It's their one job is to run fast, and so surely they can teach the rest of us how to do that just a little bit better, a little bit faster. So essentially, we're going to be looking at acceleration and top end speed. And if we read into our acceleration bullet a little bit more, it's going to occur within the first 20 meters of a sprint with athletes reaching around 90% of max velocity. So let's think about that. The majority of our top speed is built within 20 meters. So that's just something to think about, is if we are running sprints that are consistently longer than that, that may not be as efficient as possible. So maybe these shorter sprints, if we're working on power output or biomechanics, maybe those shorter sprints is kind of where we're gonna make a little bit more impact and should maybe focus a little bit more. It's just a thought. And then if you think about what actually happens on a field. So in the sport of soccer, many times, even though it is 100 yards long and somewhere around 50 yards wide, um, and I'm sure I'm wrong on that, but I believe the fields vary a little bit. I'm not sure what the Olympic setting is, so maybe I can put that in the notes below. But for all that space and distance that they have, the average sprint has been found to be about 12 yards. So if these athletes are going out and training sprints that are 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards long, that may not be as efficient as possible. And if they're doing those sprints for conditioning, that's okay. But we know, because as exercise scientists, we know that those are two different things. Now they interact with one another and there's carryover, and there's crossover, but our sprint work and our speed work may not be the same thing as our conditioning work. And so when we're training one versus the other, we want to have a reason why. We want to be, the goal is to keep the goal the goal, as we've said before in this program. So just keep that in mind. So with moving on to another bullet on this slide, top end speed, upright sprinting occurs after 20 meters and reaches 90 to 100% of max velocity. So if many of our sports are never, or rarely, not never, but rarely sprinting more than 20 meters in competition, maybe we should rethink or reconsider performing all of those longer sprints in practice. That's just something to think about. Now, there's a school of thought that believes that by polishing and improving the top end speed, it will have a trickle-down effect into the other phases of the sprinting, or speed production, excuse me. And there's great rationalization and logic for that. But I will say, whether I'm right or wrong, I am biased towards a focus and an emphasis on developing acceleration skills. I see less injuries with it, and I know for sure that my athletes are going to be accelerating on a regular basis. I don't know how often they'll be reaching top speeds. So there's two schools of thought. I'm not saying which is right or wrong. I do have a personal opinion, and I've been wrong before, and maybe I'm wrong about it this time as well. Looking at our biomechanics, getting an athlete to run well is actually a little bit of an art, not just a science, but an art. And there's so many things that can go wrong and so many things that can go right. So looking at what's going on at the ankle, whether it's dorsiflexion or plantar flexion, that's probably one of the biggest things that I'd be coaching on a regular basis during sprints. And remember, even though you're going to end up performing an extension at the ankle, what you really want to do is dorsiflex after that foot comes up off the ground, because as you dorsiflex, you're putting more space between the ball of your foot and the ground, and the more space you have, it gives you an opportunity to hit that ground a little bit harder and produce more force. And also that dorsiflexion is going to be part of some front side mechanics with that knee coming up out front as well. And with good front side mechanics, you're going to be able to drive a little bit further and get a little bit more air time from one step to the next. So looking here, we get those big, strong front side mechanics. And that's going to help create some momentum and inertia that are going to carry that sprinter through the air just one little iota, just a little bit further than if they were lazy with their dorsiflexion and with their hip flexion or just driving their knee up. And what you'll see really, really, really common is when athletes get tired, one of the first things they start to do is they quit picking up their knees. And having coaches yell knees up or pick up your knees at me, from my brief and uninspiring track career, I learned, I picked it up that, hey, you know, I might be exhausted and winded and tired and all that, but if I pick my knees up a little bit more on the front side, I'm gonna get just a little bit extra out of every single step. And so that's what we want to do is we want to optimize our running pattern. So think about picking up the toes, so dorsiflexing, even though when we plant, there is going to be an extension at the ankle. But remember, that's part of that triple extension that we've talked about before, and we'll talk about it again today, is that triple extension is part of being an athlete and part of producing force and speed. So we want some dorsiflexion at the ankle. We want to drive that knee up. We want front side mechanics on the upper body. You know, both arms are going to be really in the game. We'll talk more about that in a second here. And look at these athletes. You know, this line bows back a little bit there, but let's focus more on what's going on at the core. So looking from the down knee up into the chest cavity, that line is pretty darn straight. Doing pretty good there. Doing all right. And as that line stays straight, it provides a little bit of stability, because what we're really doing is we're trying to hold the center of the core, the abs, the plank position, whatever it is. We're attempting to stabilize that spine and allow all this other force to go on around it. When the spine goes soft and the core goes weak on a sprint, power is lost. Instead of getting transferred, power is lost and wasted. So that's why a super stable core is going to be extremely important during sprinting. So you can pretty much coach almost every joint in the body if you want to really get down to it. But a few basic coaching cues that I would really emphasize, would be dorsiflexion, and hip flexion, which is really just picking up your knee out front, and your arm action. If you can do those things while maintaining a stable spine, you're probably on a pretty good track. All right, so if I have someone sprinting, where do I want that foot landing relative to their hip? Yeah, I would really want somebody who's sprinting to have that foot land somewhere pretty close under their hip. The further that leg gets out, you know what, let's change it over to red, because that's a little bit more like ominous and more indicative of stuff we shouldn't be doing. The further that leg gets out in front of us, the higher our risk for hamstring injury is going to be. And in my experience, that's essentially how our hamstrings are tweaked during sprints, is that we're overextending and we're putting ourselves in bad biomechanical positions, and we're asking too much of that hamstring. So not only does the overstep and the overreach cause a hamstring tweak, it's also not very efficient from the idea of re-accelerating and producing more force to propel the athlete forward. So as that foot lands out in front of them, what you're actually going to get on maybe a very small level is you're actually going to get a little bit of force back into the body. So think about if this athlete was stepping out a little bit further, maybe that's her foot right there, then what's going to happen is it's almost like putting on the brakes right there, right? We're going to get a little bit of friction, and that force is going to push back into the body. Whereas a foot that lands nicely underneath can instantly produce force upwards and forward. And so it's more purely propulsive, as opposed to potentially having some counterintuitive forces on it. So if we can fix one thing during sprinting, I would keep my athletes from overreaching. So if we teach them that a big stride is a good thing, a long stride is a good thing, one of the first things they're going to do is try to kick their front foot out further. Very natural, makes sense, only is terrible for our hamstrings, and also just the physics of it are not really working in our favor. So biomechanics, Walking Tall, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, great movie. Walking Tall 2 with Kevin Sorbo, The Payback. I've never watched it. I've never heard about anybody who's watched it. But, Kevin Sorbo was sort of the man back in the day when he was playing Hercules on TV. So I trust that it's a good movie. And if anybody knows, let me know. But when it comes to sprinting, we want to be careful with when and if we start walking tall. Because once we're upright, we've basically ended our acceleration phase, and we're more or less, we've got access to the speed we have access to. So during that acceleration phase, we're able to drive and produce triple extension. But once we're upright, we're sort of just maintaining the momentum of the speed that we've already built. And if we want to re-accelerate, it basically means that we have to hunker down and lean forward again. And if you're moving quickly in an upright position, and then you take a step or two that allows you to lean forward again, and then you're continuing your strides, again, another really great opportunity to overstride and tweak a hamstring. So be patient with walking tall and getting into an upright position. When we're accelerating, we're going to have a forward lean. It's almost like if we didn't take that next step, we would almost fall on our face, especially in the first 5 to 10 yards. And we mentioned arms earlier, but I want to bring this into thought just a little bit more. Is that many coaches are taught and teach athletes to run with a 90-degree arm, kind of pivoting like a robot. But when we watch athletes run, now that makes coaching easier, but when we watch athletes run and operate, it's my opinion, and I'm not a track coach, this is not my primary skill set, and I'm sure there's coaches that have different philosophies, but it's my opinion that whole 90-degree arm thing can be good for a starting point with coaching to reinforce arm action. But once that athlete kind of gets in the flow of things, there's going to be arm extension and flexion at the elbow. Just like our sprinters here, is that they're going to open up and they're going to do what's best for them. So I almost think of it like, that arm pump breaking away from the 90-degree at all times kind of idea. I would almost, recognize that extension and flexion is almost sort of like flicking your wrist on the end of a baseball throw. That's going to give you that little extra something. So let's use our arms. Let's have a little bit of an opinion about how much to use the arms for coaching purposes. And then keep in mind that when arms are used well, they can help with that propulsion and counterbalance of what's going on with the legs. So remember that core and midsection is going to be pretty stiff and solid and braced. And those legs are churning and producing all kinds of force and power. And as that force and power gets propelled into the torso and upper body, if those arms aren't operating and firing on all cylinders, then some of that force is going to be wasted and it's not going to be very efficient. Now, if our arms can be complementary to what our legs are doing, that's great. And it's going to help us access more power and be more efficient runners from what our legs are doing. And I will say that I have seen some very powerful and quick athletes get outrun by bigger athletes with more upper body muscle mass, who just kind of throw big ugly uppercuts as they're taking those first handful of steps. So in short distances, having upper body strength and the ability to complement your lower body power output, I would say that's a little bit underappreciated. Now, on the back end of that comment, not too many athletes are neglecting especially males, not too many athletes are neglecting their upper body strength training. So if you're strength training and you're a male, you tend to be not skipping upper body days. But if you're interested in sprinting and you're maybe concerned about adding on too much muscle mass or something along those lines, just keep in mind that upper body strength may really pay off, especially if you're a sprinter or you're from an athlete that relies on acceleration ability. And again, I've seen time and again when taking maybe a football team out on the field and having an athlete who is maybe 50 pounds heavier, maybe like a thick linebacker who is sort of a meathead or just in the weight room, and watching them outrun in a 10 or 20 yard sprint, outrun an athlete who's maybe 50 pounds lighter than them, and it's their job to be fast and agile. Now, could the bigger, heavier athlete stop on a dime and turn like the lighter one? I'm not saying that, but I'm talking about in a straight line and force and acceleration, things like that. Those upper body, those big, ugly uppercut punches being thrown during acceleration phase, there's something to be said for that. And just to remind you all about the importance of triple extension, and this is a slide we've used earlier in the program, is what muscles are we really looking for? Well, at the hip, it'd be the glute and hamstrings. The knees are quadriceps, and ankles are calves. And whether you're a sprinter or not, or you rely on linear sprinting, you could even just use sprinting to help develop your skill set for golfing or for shooting in basketball or for Olympic lifting, because sprinting is triple extension as well, especially in that acceleration phase. If you look at that female athlete sprinting there, she's got a good forward lean going. And what is she? She's got, let's get my annotation out here. Yeah. What else she got? Oh, yeah, toes up, nice work. Big front knee. She's throwing big, ugly arms, both on the front side and the back side. That core is in a straight line. Heck yeah, she's doing a great job there. So if we can get athletes who maybe never need a sprint in their sport, but if we can get them out here doing this, would it help and maybe apply to this triple extension here? I think it might. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We can train all those muscles to help us be sprinters, or we can just do big movements, like maybe a sprint or maybe a prowler push, and that's going to help us produce and be more effective in that triple extension as well. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that you may want to bring in sprinting for non-sprinting athletes. For the reasons that we've talked about earlier, is that a way to improve your sprint would be to improve your biomechanics and to improve your strength, which improves your power, which can improve your rate of force development. But if we're sprinting and improving our rate of force development, that may help us in whatever sport or event we're working on, whether that's golf or basketball or I don't know, jiu-jitsu. Okay, so our rate of force development. So this has a little bit to do with our stretch shortening cycle. And looking at the event that we have and the length of the stretch shortening cycle, and maybe just considering if that's a fast or slow event. So sprinting is our fastest stretch shortening cycle. So maybe that should inspire us all to keep in mind that if we want to improve our ability to create a stretch shortening cycle, that produces power and force. Even if we're not sprinters, maybe we should go sprint every once in a while. There we go, lost my cursor. And then what's our basically longest and slowest one? Right there, race walking. So just not quite as fast. But again, with race walking, you always have to have 1 foot on the ground. There's always got to be 1 foot in contact. And so you're not going to have the same approach as you would with sprinting, where everyone is invited to spend as little time on the ground as possible. But maybe you want to look at improving conditioning or doing some speed work that is non-impact. So maybe there's an injury history. Maybe race walking is a great way to work on your stride rate, but not really doing too much of triple extension or some of the other things that we've talked about. And so you can kind of break this down and look at it from just different philosophies of why you would want to do different things. But what I would do is I would mix it up. I would not always go out and sprint in the same length for the same intensity over and over again, because a little bit of variety goes a long way sometimes. But something to think about when we're talking about rate of force development, especially during the stretch shortening cycle. So looking at the rate of force development, now this has a little bit more to do with what goes on with a barbell in the weight room. So maximum strength is going to be up here. And so it's going to be maximally strong, but it's going to take us a long time to produce that strength. And that's why heavy weights tend to be lifted slowly. So it's not that the individual isn't trying their best. It's just that this is the maximum amount of weight that the individual can lift. And so it takes their nervous system some extra time to keep firing and keep collecting and gathering muscle fibers that are firing and helping out. Now, if we can get that nervous system to fire a little bit faster and those muscle fibers to be a little bit more accessible by way of wiring the nervous system to additional motor units, this will allow us to produce more force more quickly. And over here with maximal velocity, we're not producing a whole lot of force because look, we're only working at around 30% of our 1 RM, but we're producing that force very quickly. There's not much time right here. So naturally, this is where all athletes are going to fall with their barbell movements, is that really heavy movements are going to take a long time to produce force, and it's going to be slower. And as we grab lighter weights, we're going to move faster. So that's just how humans operate on a normal basis. And the goal there is that if we get stronger, we will be able to produce more force in a shorter time. But we don't always have to improve our rate of force development via maximal strength training. We can do other things. We can do speed training. We could actually go very light and just hone in and work on getting our muscles firing and training in that way. And just a reminder is that Louis Simmons with the Westside Barbell Club, they refer to some of that training with barbells as their dynamic effort days, is that they go in and they lift lighter weights very quickly, and they do it in clusters that fatigue the nervous system. And then the nervous system is required to activate and collect more muscle fibers and more motor units that are firing to help move the weight in the same way. And they emphasize that they can lift lighter weights. So let's say an athlete bench presses 400 pounds, but on a given day they have 200 pounds on a bar. Their philosophy is that if you move that bar fast enough, you can put more than 200 pounds of force into the bar, and this can train your nervous system to produce more force than normal, And you can do that without breaking down your joints and without breaking down the muscles. And so it's an option to rotate into their training that picks on their nervous system more than their joints and muscles. And then on other workouts, they might do maximal effort or repetition effort, and those things will pick on the muscles a little bit more, the nervous system again, and may cause a little bit more damage to the joints a little bit. Not intentionally, but just as sort of like a collateral damage of intense training. And so again, looking here, we have that lower line is where the athlete is going to produce less force overall. They're going to produce that in the time that they produce in. And then with training, we can improve our rate of force development. We can improve our strength. Not only can we improve our strength, but we can also improve our speed. And by training both, we'd have a better shot of improving our rate of force development. And looking at some speed assessments, there's the 40-yard dash, which is very popular, not necessarily ideal, and I'll come back to that soon, but it's popular, and therefore it's sort of just something universal. It's sort of the norm that allows people to communicate as to how fast they are, and you kind of get an idea. The 100-meter sprint, 10 to 20-yard accelerations, 10-yard flies. So those 10 to 20-yard accelerations, just giving the athlete a short amount of time to produce that force and to see how fast they are. And then that 10-yard fly is perhaps giving them an approach zone of maybe 20 to 30 yards, and then only timing them. So let's say you have an approach zone of 30 yards. Then from yard 30 to yard 40 would be your 10-yard fly. You would measure them from in those 10-yard segments between 30 and 40 yards. And that allows you to sort of see how an athlete is able to run or produce force when they're already in motion, which is really common in sport. All right, so let's look at our 100-meter sprint briefly. So we talked earlier about how an athlete is going to tend to pretty much finish their acceleration in the first 20 meters. Well, that might be true for sport athletes who are not as highly trained or specified as a track sprinter. But with track sprinting, what is ideal is pretty much to take that first 20 to 30%, 40 to 60% of our 100-meter sprint and maintain an acceleration phase. So the forward lean, head is down a little bit, bigger sort of choppier steps. And then as you go on, you start to pick your head up, you start to come upright just a little bit, and your movements become less exaggerated and more efficient. And then as you are entering that 60-yard marker or so, you're going to start to stand up tall like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Kevin Sorbo. And as you're standing up tall, what you're really doing is just maintaining your posture and trying to maintain your speed. And so that core is braced and your wheels are spinning, the legs are pumping, the arms are pumping. And then in those last 10 to 20 meters, we tend to maybe start to run out of a little bit of our ATP. So that can be a problem. That can be a limiting factor. So maybe just a little bit of fatigue sets in there. Or excuse me, not fatigue, but just loss of HP substrate. So that could be a typical 100-meter sprint. And again, if you're not a track sprinter and you're using 100-meter or 100-yard sprints to boost your performance on the basketball court or on the soccer field, you may want to reconsider whether you're doing sprint work or it's a conditioning day. And again, they can have overlap, and they definitely do. One definitely benefits the other, but they are also different. So keep in mind why you're doing it. Now on the 40-yard dash, we're going to see a similar phase, but what's really going to happen is sort of somewhere between, just under or just after 20-yard marker, we're going to complete the acceleration phase. And then those athletes are usually typically able to maintain their velocity through the end of the run there. And so what I'll do, and I'm borrowing this from Coach Joe DeFranco, is I basically teach them to accelerate for 20 yards, and then I say coast, but I'm just going to say that if you're not done accelerating by 20, maybe 25 yards, then you're out of luck, because that's your window to accelerate. And after that, you stand up and you coast and you stand tall with a brace core and you pump those arms and legs for all you're worth. And what you're going to see is that somewhere around that 30-yard mark, if athletes continue to try to accelerate, and this is a 40-yard run, so it's a different approach than that longer 100-meter sprint where athletes are a little bit more specified for sprinting. What you're going to see around that 30-yard mark is hamstrings are going to start to go. So if we're running shorter distances and then just maintaining our top end speed that we got in that shorter acceleration, we're going to save our hamstrings. And so pushing and trying to accelerate for the whole 40 yards and not very efficient. So in the 40-yard, we will stand up. Let's see, let's maybe get a different color here. In the 40-yard, we're going to stand up basically somewhere between 20 and 25 and sort of do that speed coast, that maximal velocity coasting. Whereas that standing up for the longer run is really going to happen in that 40 to 60 meter window. So keep in mind that even with these sprints, you're sprinting in a straight line, you're still not doing the same thing. There's still some different thoughts and some different approaches and philosophies. And I'm sure there's more that I haven't even listed today. Why is the 40-yard dash so popular? It seems like everybody runs it. They run it in the NFL Combine. I've seen, lacrosse coaches run their athletes on it. Why is that so dang important? Well, from what I understand, the 40-yard dash was first popularized through football. And the idea was, if you're looking for an athlete who can sprint, who can be part of whether they're a great offensive player or defensive player, okay, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if you just need them to be on special teams and maybe be on a punt or a kickoff team, well, specifically on the punt, if from where they punt, with the hang time of the ball that's kicked, and then the ball is received, and then the ball is run back, if you have a athlete on special teams who can run down kind of underneath that ball while the ball's up here doing its thing, they're down here sprinting. If they can run that 40-yard quickly and efficiently, that gives them a better chance to get down to that ball receiver at sort of an optimal window. And that's about it. So, football it's so popular, and it's hoisted up and held as such a, the game for everybody. I don't know how else to put it. It's popular. And in the strength and conditioning community, it's almost sort of the gold standard, as if you work with them, then you can work with anybody for whatever reason. Not saying that's right, not saying that's wrong, whatever. But that made the 40-yard dash is almost like the norm now for what you're going to run to tell how fast you are. But if you ask me, chop that thing in half, see how fast the athletes are in that 20 yards window, because that's what they're going to be running on a much more consistent and regular basis out on the sporting field. And while you're testing it, you're probably not going to get anywhere near the amount of hamstring tweaks and injuries as you do in a 40-yard dash. Because again, around that 30-yard marker, athletes start to open up and they try to reach for that extra distance and take a little bit longer step. And that's when their hamstring kind of goes pop, So if you're training athletes or testing athletes or training yourself or testing yourself, I would encourage you to just work on 10 to 20 yard sprints. And timing those will be a great reflection and indicator for how your 40-yard sprint would go if you were to be running it. So you're getting basically the same amount of information, but you're cutting your risks down greatly. And that 10 to 20 yard sprint is going to be more applicable because that's something you're actually going to be doing in sport versus a 40-yard straight line run, which it happens, but it's just not nearly as common as the shorter distance sprints. So just some things to keep in mind. And again, what is the length of speed? Well, for our purposes, I would say 30 seconds is probably going to be our top end of what we're talking about today. And again, there's good arguments for why you might extend that longer, but we're just going to be kind of lazy, and we're just going to basically say because this chart says that 30 seconds is basically the top end. So that means for many athletes, the 200-yard sprint is going to be basically as far as we would go. So if we're building this energy system, maybe we don't need to train for big, long runs or take, multi-mile runs and things like that. So speed training is different from conditioning or work capacity, as we refer to it in this program. And it's also different from just mental toughness. So if you want to do mental toughness workouts and challenge people and make them throw up last night's dinner or whatever it is, you can do that, but they're probably not going to be producing the highest quality of speed that they're capable of. And if you're doing speed training and your speed training is slow, are you really training speed, or are you just conditioning them and teaching them to run slowly? That is another thing that I would challenge everyone to take a step back and think about. I apologize. I should have drank more water earlier today. So I'm making up for it now on you guys' time. Sorry about that. Something else I want you guys to keep in mind is our characteristics of muscle fiber types. Now we know that those type 2B muscle fibers are going to help us run fast and produce speed. But if we want our body to sort of transform and mutate into sort of optimizing those type 2B muscle fibers, we must beware of overtraining or spending too much time training as if we were a type 1 muscle fiber athlete. So if you are doing a lot of slow activity, a lot of fatigue intensive activity, if your activity is low force producing, you may not be training conducive to producing speed. So I obviously want my cross country runner to be fast, but the type of speed that they need, it might come more from that type 1 muscle fiber. Whereas my 100-meter sprinters, my hurdlers, my high jumpers, my track and field throwers, my soccer forwards, my dancer, I don't know. Depending on how long your dance routine is, I guess that's not my area of speciality. But we want those athletes to be type 2B muscle fibers. We don't want them moving quickly, and we want them to be producing force so that they can run fast. So keep in mind, speed work is one thing, work capacity or conditioning work is another thing, and mental toughness training is something else altogether. Now, do they all influence one another? Yes. But if you're overemphasizing your conditioning and your work capacity, and that's what you're putting a lot of time into, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get athletes who are well conditioned and able to work harder and longer. But that does not mean they're going to be faster, and not in that 30 seconds and less window like we've been talking about, because you're working on the wrong energy system, and you're influencing the wrong type of movement, and you're mutating the wrong type of muscle fiber. And after that spiel I just went on, I'll say that I felt that way for a while. And then someone introduced me to some of the information put out by Tony Holler. I've never been introduced to him, don't have a relationship with him. But this coach, Tony Holler, who's training sprinters out of a high school over Naperville High School over in Illinois, I love his philosophy. I'm gonna push it on you guys just a little bit. I will remind you that it's just a philosophy, and there are many ways to skin the cat. But Coach Holler, apparently, he talks about coaching for over 30 years, and then basically having an epiphany that he was exhausting his athletes and running them into the ground, and that they weren't moving quickly, they weren't having fun, they weren't feeling good, and they weren't performing well. And he basically pulled a 180, and he reduced their volume. He increased the quality of work being done, and he shortened his entire, even his practices went from like 2-hour conditioning sessions. And that's great if you've got an endurance athlete who needs that. But he talks about how he had the athletes that are there to sprint and to run fast. And so he's gotten away from running them into the ground. Now he does have some parts of his training will make them exhausted and want to throw up and make them want to quit. But the bulk of his training is on high quality, sprints that allow them to rest in between, have them feeling good. They go out and have hard runs that are high quality, and then he gets them out of there. And he talks about how that cats in the wild, they don't jog. These big predatory cats that run so fast and run down game, they basically sleep, and then when they're hungry, they get up and they go hunting. And he pulled that philosophy and that sort of that metaphor onto his team, is that when his athletes feel good, he runs them fast. And when they don't feel good, he maybe tells them to go home or something. And I'm not saying that he doesn't exhaust them occasionally, but that went from being the bulk of his program to being a factor in his program. So I would encourage us all to maybe rethink the training that we've done as athletes, maybe the coaching that we've done, maybe the type of training that we're currently putting ourselves through. Is that if we want to run faster, why would we spend a whole bunch of time running slowly? Think about the logic there. So I'm a fan of his philosophy and his teachings, and he is a specialist who has some great logic that he can put behind it. Whereas I'm around it, but I'm involved in many things, many aspects of training, and I would not say that I have the lingo and the quality of communication on the topic that he does. So if anybody is interested in doing some track coaching at any point, especially for sprinters, I would encourage you to check out Tony Holler. I really like his philosophy, as you can tell, and it makes sense to me. And to pull from an article that he wrote, you'll have to excuse me while I basically read from the slide here. Once in a while, you get a sprinter who's genetically destined for greatness. If you are a track coach or speed coach and you haven't read The Sports Gene by David Epstein, you are a pretender. Read. Anyways, Anyway, it is obvious to me that we don't plant beans and grow corn. The elite sprinters are truly found and not created. Dry phase is mostly coaching. Speed is mostly talent. I'll stop here. So I would encourage you all to read The Sports Gene by David Epstein. Great book. And what he's talking about with dry phase being mostly coaching, that goes back to our acceleration movement pattern, where the athlete is leaning forward and they are taking their steps, and there's technique, and you're working on biomechanics, and you're working on force production. And then as he talks about speed being mostly talent, that's sort of referring back to just genetics, is that some people are born with more of those type 2B muscle fibers. Some people's nervous systems are a little bit more aligned for rapid firing and for producing these quick movements. And so it's his belief is that he, even as a track coach, and it's what he does is make people faster, he believes that these top level sprinters are not being created, but they're basically being born. And then it's his job as a track coach is to help them along without screwing them up. And I'll continue with his third bullet here. It's strange, but when you go to a clinic, you see presentations by coaches who were blessed with a freaky sprinter or two. We all want to know how coaches create such an athlete. The presenter hides behind a sophisticated and complex PowerPoint that overwhelms the crowd and makes everyone feel inferior. Remember, the presenter is the beneficiary of genetic talent, and deep down, he knows it. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and playing solitaire. Winning and losing is predetermined after the shuffling. College coaches don't create speed, they find speed. And again, this is his opinion. But what I would say is that if we have a leader in educating track coaches who is arguing that that top level speed is mostly talent, or something that athletes are just kind of bringing to the table, then should we, as non-track coaches, how much time should we spend on getting athletes to be faster in these sprints? If this man who's basically dedicated his life to creating sprinters or making sprinters better, if he's almost thrown his hands up and saying that, you kind of get what you get, it's predetermined, how talented they're going to be. Now, he's not saying that he can't help people run faster who aren't super talented or born to be Olympians. And he writes on that as well. But I wanted to bring this forward to make us all rethink. If we're doing speed work, how much speed work do we want to do if we're not going to totally change, the classification of how fast these athletes are running? If we can do other things like improve their conditioning or improve their strength, if we can make bigger improvements elsewhere, maybe we shouldn't be doing speed work 5 days a week. If he's a track coach and it's his job to work with sprinters and he's not running his athletes into the ground, then why are so many exercise scientists or coaches doing that? Just something to think about. Now, I'll sort of finish on that with the Goldilocks principle. So when we're working with speed, let's think about our distance. Let's think about our intensity. Let's think about our volume. Let's think about how the performance is. If our athletes are running slow all the time in training, why would we show up on game day and expect them to run fast? If we're not giving them the opportunity to run well, we're just asking them to run far, maybe we need to rethink that a little bit. There's probably a sweet spot somewhere in there where we're pushing them hard, but we're not pushing them so hard that they're getting hamstring tweaks and hip flexor issues and they're running slowly, and it really just becomes a conditioning bout or a mental toughness bout. So I just want to leave you all with that, is that, this is definitely a combination of art and science. And somewhere in the middle, we're going to find that Goldilocks principle, is that sweet spot is how much speed work to do. And I will leave you guys with that. Thank you.